occasionally to win. I'll also share with you some sample analytical frameworks that I use with students in order to help them use those as tools for analysis of the history that I present. So what is ethnic studies? In my understanding of ethnic studies, I see it as systems of power that we challenge. We as ethnic studies educators challenge those systems of power. And part of those systems of power include those who write our histories, who write our news, who write our media oftentimes. So we learn to challenge those and bring in our own stories, our own histories as well. And part of those histories is a history of resistance, of resisting those systems of power that have oppressed us throughout our histories. And in doing so, we empower ourselves. And in that empowering ourselves, we teach young people that it is our legacy to continue the struggle against systems of power that oppress until we really do actualize justice, what we strive for in this country. Ethnic studies, I took this, this idea from the Ethnic Studies Advisory Group out of Seattle Public Schools. A lot of people ask, well, what is it? Is it multicultural education? Is it culturally responsive teaching? Is it critical pedagogy? And the answer is yes, it's all of those. And so when we talk about ethnic studies, if one is missing, then we need to try to focus and try to bring it in so that we're incorporating all of these. I like to also think about the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, because his ideas about really educating young people for liberating their minds and striving toward a just society by critically examining their society. That is, for me, a cornerstone of ethnic studies. And so I won't read this for you. I'll let you go ahead and read his quote. Okay, so we're not just looking for conformity, we're looking for transformation, to transform society to become better. Ethnic studies framework. So as part of our work in Seattle Public Schools, we started by really articulating frameworks for ethnic studies. And we did draw from existing frameworks out of, I believe it was Oakland School District. And so we started with the idea that ethnic studies does include identity and trying to really get us to think about our identities. How can we develop positive identities and even considering the identities of other folks? Ethnic studies also focuses in on power and oppression. So yes, that can be depressing, but that doesn't mean you leave it out of the history because it's there. It really is part of our history. So to counter that, however, we also include a history of resistance and liberation. One without the other isn't complete. It's just a history of victims if we leave it at power and oppression. And if we go right to resistance and liberation, people don't know what you're resisting and why you need liberation. And then another framework was that of action, getting our students to become change agents or think of themselves as being empowered to take action to make change or transformative change for the better. Identity is defined by ethnic studies. How do we see ourselves? Okay, and so I, as an African-American woman, how do I see myself? But there's other parts of my identity as well. And at the University of Washington, I learned something called positionality, those positions that I occupy in society that really have a lot to do with how I think and how I behave and how I interact. So, identity, the ways in which we view ourselves as members of distinct communities with distinct cultures and traditions. And with that, we have learning targets that we hope that we can impart an understanding that impacts our understanding of US history, that informs our analysis of history and society. How I see history and society based upon my positionality would be very different from how Donald Trump sees analyzes history and society. And then with that understanding, we should be able to explain our own positionality, to realize that we come with this worldview. And so in that, we may be able to develop a better understanding between us when we know that you come from a different worldview in looking at the world and interacting with the world than I do. So how can we maybe bridge that and begin to have a meeting in some way of the minds? Then the power and oppression framework as defined by ethnic studies. Individuals and groups manipulate resources in order to amass wealth and influence. So we look at that in our history. We also look at this idea that once these individuals are able to amass their wealth and their influence, they believe it accords them the right to define social stratification, the social hierarchy. And they act to uphold the implications therein, meaning they want to maintain their power, and they take actions to do that. In this, it moves to the side of oppression. And so we want people to understand that the rise of industrial capitalism, I'm going to have to move this, intersects with labor exploitation and oppression. And the expansion of US political and economic power, it impacts ordinary people. And so some may say that this is anti-United States, but really it's teaching the truth and seeing how power amasses power, maintains power, but what's the implication for the rest of us, labor, people in other nations? We also, at least the way I interpret this, as part of this power and oppression, I think we also have to look at the ideologies and values that are kind of brought to the United States, but also kind of everywhere, not just the United States. And so in bringing the colonists to the United States, the colonists brought their values that drove and continue to drive US history and systems of oppression. And so when I say that it isn't in any way to bring Europe down, it's just the reality that there were values brought here, and those values were imperialistic. And we actually, in the United States, we internalize them. They're our values. We love property, private property. And so that's a value, accumulation of wealth. A lot of us value that. And those values were paramount in with the settler colonists. And then we also need to acknowledge as well that who tells the history controls the narrative. They control the narrative, and when you can control the story, you can oftentimes control what people believe and how they think. And so this is part of the oppression. When you control the way people think, you don't need a lot of strength because you can control them based upon how they think. So the next framework, history of resistance and liberation as defined by ethnic studies, the history of resisting oppression as carried out by the oppressed groups themselves. And so I like to look at the history that not just where somebody else saves the day, but we ourselves came together in some way and exerted our power, and maybe in collaboration with others, but we were part of that story of resisting oppression ourselves. And those learning targets that we hope to impart, European imperial and colonialist values must be challenged within and outside ourselves in our resistance and liberation struggles. Now, you may be thinking, well, what does that mean? As I said before, we've internalized a lot of those values. William Katz, he mentions 4 in his book, Black Indians, private property, the concept of private property, also the Bible. And when I say Bible, I am a Christian, but I do know that a lot of people are not tolerant of other religions. And that was part of coming in and believing that the native people and their spiritualities were inferior to what the Bible teaches. That's a value that I can look around and see even now. He also mentions muskets. And what he means by that is militarism, using force to take or overpower. And then, of course, we still see the value of Anglo supremacy, racism. So even though we're talking, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, these values are still with us today, and we need to challenge them, both outside of ourselves and inside of ourselves, as part of our resistance and liberation. The value of early and contemporary ethnic coalitions. We have not done it all ourselves. It's when we've had the ability to join together in solidarity that we've been the strongest. And I see that in our history, and I hope to impart that in my ethnic studies history. But also there's a push-pull of resistance and reactionary oppression. And so it's not just, oh, we won the day, but there's going to be some kind of reaction from the other side. And so we're constantly kind of pushing and pulling for this liberation. That is a big theme within the history that I teach. And then we also need to impart in ethnic studies how different groups of people defended their dignity. It's a history that is a legacy, because I hear so many young people saying, I don't care. But then I hear a lot of people saying, I do care. So my job as a teacher is to get more to say, I do care, and this is my legacy to continue this fight for liberation. Action, as defined by ethnic studies, is fostering a sense of advocacy, empowerment, and action in our students that creates internal motivation to be a change maker. And the learning standards, the varied actions people have taken and continue to take in their struggle towards social justice, we want to bring those in. How informative or persuasive materials can be produced to further social justice causes. That includes everything, every kind of media. And then recognize and challenge dominant narratives that support oppressive ideologies and actions. A dominant narrative, I think just a picture of that standard textbook should have given you some idea. But the dominant narrative is generally not from the perspective of people like myself. It's from people who are in power, people who wield power and wealth. And oftentimes their narratives are dominant because they control the media. They can control oftentimes what we teach in schools. And so part of my job and trying to bring about action is to recognize and to challenge. That's part of the action. So now I'm going to move to the praxis, where the theory that I just spoke about, where I try to combine it into practice and bringing it into my teaching. And keep in mind that this is how I have interpreted the theory, how I have interpreted how I could bring theory into practice. There is no one way to do it. And when you look for one way, you're looking at a canned curriculum. And that is something that ethnic studies really teaches against, that you really should be looking at your individual systems of teaching, you and your knowledge, what would resonate with your students, and then develop your own way of teaching this type of material. So this is my attempt.
Dr. Jamerson, before we move forward, this seems like a good quick pause point. Folks, if you have any questions for Dr. Jamerson so far on maybe the first portion of this, feel free to add that to the chat and we can ask it before we move on to the application. And I just want to make sure we could see.
Okay.
Yeah. And or feel free to raise your Zoom hand if you want to ask verbally. But. Okay. All right. Well, we're seeing none at the moment, so let's go ahead and move forward. If you do have questions, feel free to use the chat to enter them as we go. And at the second half, once we are wrapped up, or then we can certainly pause and do our Q&A then. Thank you.
Okay. So in this unit, African Americans, our ability to resist, to join together, occasionally win. I began with these essential questions or ideas. How are historical events often represented to further the interest of the existing power structure? Okay, and so I want students to think about these textbooks that generally are presented to you, or any kind of media or text. Whose interest does it further? Does it further your interest as probably a working class, oftentimes child of color? Or is it furthering the interests of those in power, those who already have the power? Also, how can history present it as a counter narrative to the perspective of the existing power structure? So they oftentimes know how it's been presented to them throughout their school experience, but then they have to begin to think about how can it be different? What would that look like? And then how have African Americans engaged in collective efforts in their struggle for the democratic ideals upon which the United States is based? Okay. And so I'd like to bring in this idea of the ideals of the United States and come back to it consistently. All right, so one part of my teaching I consider to be culturally responsive teaching. And part of that culturally responsive teaching is meeting students where they are, but I let them know that what I'm presenting to them is primarily little bits of college text. When I say little bits, Howard Zinn's first chapter, I believe, is 21 pages. I give them 4.5 carefully selected, but I let them know I am going to guide them through. And as I guide them through that reading, I need them to annotate first the vocabulary that I anticipate that they will not know. So they have to first, in the margins, annotate the vocabulary. And I give them all the definitions at the end of the reading. And so that's kind of a pre-reading strategy. And I tell them, when I went to college and I would read, I had been reading high school textbooks and I had not been taught how to read college text. And I begin in my own mind to think, is it true what they say that I'm only here because of affirmative action? And so I need to let them know you need to start collecting these words. And that is part of continually uh, trying to get them empowered by doing this annotation before we begin to read. Then I give them, it's inquiry based. I have questions embedded in the reading. We read the question first, then you highlight anything that will help you answer that question. So I'm taking them step by step through a process that I hope that they will begin, because this is kind of a gradual release, that they will begin at some point internalize that this is how I deconstruct college text. This is a strategy that we had been doing at middle college back in the 90s. And I looked up, just trying to find some kind of literature that would back me up. And I did find it on the Teaching Tolerance website. They called it analyting. And so it's a form of analyting, but it's very structured analyting. And I did that mainly because, as I said, I need to help students develop those skills. A lot of people say, well, ethnic studies is, this or that, but if it's culturally responsive teaching, it's also empowering kids with the skills they need should they go on to college and not feel like something is wrong with them when they don't know what they just read. That is a strategy that I've used for several years, and it's actually been pretty effective with primarily the students that I teach in alternative education, which are kids of color, oftentimes from working and poor backgrounds. They annotate the margins with the definitions. They read with a purpose so that they're telling me what should be highlighted. And I ask them questions along the way. It's guided reading. We think aloud. Is that going to answer my question? And then I can go outside of the explicit questions that I asked, so that as we're reading this together and I'm modeling my thinking, I have them add more annotations, ask questions, make connections, and connect these things that we're reading to the big ideas that I want them to really walk away with, like values that I mentioned earlier. We have authentic conversations about the reading. Even though I have talking points, I want the kids to know that this is a real conversation, that it's conversational learning. It's not just me lecturing. Unfortunately, in this world of everything online, I'm finding that a lot of it is just lecturing. But generally, we're sitting around a table because it's alternative ed. I had that luxury of more like a seminar, college seminar, and as we read through and deconstruct, we're not only looking at the content, but we're also talking about the big ideas and how those ideas affect their lives or play into their own lives, even if it's history. Like I said, a lot of this stuff is still around. And as I said before, it's inquiry-based, really asking questions along the way. That part of the critical pedagogy piece that is part of ethnic studies. We provide students with analytical frameworks first as tools to critically analyze the history. So as you're reading and talking about the history, it's not in a vacuum. You've got this analytical framework that you're using in order to analyze the history itself. So I begin, my first lesson is contradicting stories of history, and Howard Zinn has named those types of history a memory of states history, which I kind of equate to a master narrative, versus conflict of interest, the counter narrative. I want my students to have a thorough understanding of what each of those is, and there are different characteristics that fall under memory of states and different characteristics that fall under a conflict of interest. And it's in, I can tell you, in the edition that I have, it's pages 8 through 11 in chapter 1 of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And then this is an example of us putting this on digitally now that, we're in a digital world with COVID. Normally, I have the definitions or the characteristics of each type of history cut up into different papers, and then I have a T-chart on a big, butcher block paper, and then they have to take and they have to talk to each other and figure out which one goes under memory of state, which one goes under conflict of interest. And so they have that conversation and it reinforces their understanding of this way of telling history in two different ways, according to Howard Zinn. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way. There are other historians, other people that you could read and bring in if that's how you want to equip your students with analytical tools. But this is one that I have used that seems to work pretty well for a lot of my students. I also like for students to then apply their newfound knowledge of these two ways of telling history, this history from the perspective of leaders and people in power that kind of quickly, they'll mention an atrocity and quickly bury it under other things that are more important to them, that memory of states kind of way of telling history. And then that conflict of interest way of telling history, in which it's told from the people who kind of suffered under the policies of leaders and what they did about it and how they were able maybe to resist by joining together. And so I've come up with some examples out of James Lowen's book. He's very good about giving me examples of textbook examples as opposed to truth examples. And so then they apply, is this memory of states or not? Okay. Then I start the actual history itself with one of my favorite books written by William Katz. William Katz is not African American, and so sometimes I get some pushback that ethnic studies needs to be by the people who were studying, and I would say not all the time. And so Katz wrote a book, Black Indians, that I think is really a nice way to start. You may have another book that you think this would be a great way to start. I say go for it. But Katz, in his second chapter, he starts with the dark democracy. And so it is the story of the first Africans that were brought to mainland North America and resisted the Spanish that had enslaved them, and eventually run off and join with the Native Americans, and they make their own community as the Spanish go back to Spain because it was a failed attempt. But because Katz calls it a dark democracy, this is a great way for me to introduce the democracy, the Declaration of Independence, and to really speak to, these were the first foreigners on this continent to really practice democracy with these Native Americans. And so it's a nice segue into teaching Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. When I do teach the American Revolution, I ask the question, would you have fought on the side of the Patriots or on the side of the British? And then give the story of Harry Washington, George Washington's slave, who fought for the British because he was looking for his freedom. And so it's through the lens of an African-American experience, but you're still teaching United States history. I also like Black Indians because I'm then able to introduce another theoretical framework. And in this way, I feel like I'm really looking at multicultural education and critical pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching. I think all three of those come into play when I'm looking at the chapters 3 and 4 from Black Indians. Black Indians is an excellent example of dialectical contradiction in history, the two opposing sides. Escaped slaves escaping to the Native Americans and forming their own societies. Maroon societies is what they're called. And oftentimes this is a history that is neglected, but it's a history of resistance. It's a history of people joining together. Black people, Native Americans becoming Black Indians, and then the colonial power in some way trying to fight back, legal, making laws in order to try to divide these people. And this is just kind of, it's a history that we're looking at way back, in the 1600s, but it's a history that exists today. It's what we do today, divide and conquer. And so that dialectical contradiction that's really illustrated in Katz's work, it's just one law after another. But there's other history books that would illustrate the same thing. It really depends on what you choose. But I like this one. It may not be forever though. I may find something I like better. Now, in doing that, I'm trying to weave in the background of United States history. So even though it's through this African-American experience or lens, I'm still weaving in big ideas from United States history. And of course, one of those big ideas, as you know, is manifest destiny. And so I'm able to connect the manifest destiny, believing that it's God's will that European Americans spread their influence and take over the continent. And so in doing that, I'm tying it to, again, what I've already taught with Black Indians, because now we've got Andrew Jackson taking over the southern states, taking that land away from Native Americans in the Indian Removal Act. And then the fate of the Seminole Indians, Black Indians, moving to the West, but then moving down into Mexico. And so I'm able to get some history of the Mexican people as well. And so even though it's this lens of through the African-American experience, I'm still connected with Native Americans and Native Americans of Mexico as well. Now, analyzing history, that dialectical contradiction, that's part of the slavery and slave insurrection. And so I can move on. So yes, I do teach slavery, but I teach slavery more from a perspective of resistance to slavery, that slaves, a lot of times, I've even heard students ask me, they've asked me the question, why didn't we do anything? How is it that they kept us enslaved so many hundreds of years? I would have done something. So they need to know we did do something. And so I don't spend a whole lot of time, but I have an insurrections timeline and so that they can see that there is this slave resistance, but at the same time, they're seeing that there's that push-pull institutional racism and laws and slave codes that continually try to oppress and suppress those kinds of resistances. I also need students to understand that part of the reason they were able to keep us enslaved so long is through the psychological trauma that institution imparted. And so that too is oftentimes part of my teaching. I then add lessons on US, what the common textbooks might say, westward expansion, but I teach them that the westward invasion was really a history of two sides trying to spread slavery throughout the continent, and that push-pull of people trying to keep slavery out of the new states of the West. And then that moves into the Texas annexation. That's part of why Texas wanted to leave Mexico, because Mexico had outlawed slavery. And then that war with Mexico. So again, I'm blending the US history, but also through that experience of African American and wanting to expand slavery throughout the West. Then I move on, coalitions, joining across diverse groups. That's the Abolitionist Bloc Party. This is kind of an idea that I took from the Zen Project. The Zen Project does have an abolitionist kind of tea party that only includes African American abolitionists. I put together, my lesson is abolitionists who were from different races. I even include the Black president of Mexico because he, under his leadership, he ended slavery in Mexico. And so really, he was the first person in Americas to really be a successful abolitionist, to abolish slavery in Mexico. So he's part of my block party as well, but I need students to see that it was an effort in which we came together in solidarity as people across races, ethnicities, genders. I start with a background of the abolitionist movement, move on to John Brown's plan of attack, and then show Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech. Formerly, I used to use James Earl Jones speaking in a YouTube video, Howard Zinn's Voices of the People. But now, I don't know if you've seen this, but Frederick Douglass's grandchildren are doing that speech. And so currently we are using that. And then the students do have a copy of the speech themselves that they can follow. And I have an activity that I want them to do so that they're interacting with the words in some way as we go along. Then I also like to include I'm going slower than I anticipated. I better speed it up. I also like to include glory. We can't look at the whole film because it isn't free to everyone, but I'm trying to give them bits and pieces of it and how it fits with the conflict of interest kinds of characteristics of history. And then we look at Reconstruction and how it sets the stage for the African-American experience in the 20th century. And I use a mixer that the Zen Education Project has put together for that. They actually have a couple of different Reconstruction lessons, and I've tried both. And so that might be a place to start if you're not sure how you might want to teach Reconstruction. I always put a little spin on it, a little different for what fits for me and my kids. And so, but that is might be a place to start if you're wondering, how would I teach Reconstruction? And then I end the unit by kind of connecting it to contemporary issues. Black Lives Matter, part of their platform is advocating for reparations for African Americans. And I do a lot of cutting and pasting of complex text. So I did a lot of cutting and pasting with Coates's article, A Case for Reparations, tying it to the history of African-American experiences in this country that tie to the case he makes that African-Americans may be entitled to some type of reparation. And then there's also a little thing I do with the debate as to what that might look like, because people aren't sure how that would actually come to be, what a concrete what that would look like concretely. And my assessment with students, I generally do not give an exam, but I give a study guide as if they were going to have to study for the exam. Remember, I am interested in preparing them for higher institutions should they choose to go that route. They may choose not to, but at least I feel like I'm giving you the tools so that you have the power to make those decisions. So keep calm. There's no test, but there is a study guide. And the study guide is in the order of every assignment I give you. And so they have to go back to their assignments, extract from their assignments answers that go into their study guide. I've seen some students go, I can't read this, or this answer doesn't make any sense. It's such a nice way to build in self-assessment, and they do a better job the next time. And so you also can give them choice of projects, visual presentations with captions work nicely. I've tried that. Research-based, action-based organizations. If I come up with some organizations that maybe they could kind of research that are taking action. One organization is a reparations organization that comes up in Coates' article. It's always open book. So in the open book is their assignments and their notes. I need to feel like they have produced what they need in order to be successful. And that is the end. I'm sorry that I took so long, but I took more time this time, Paulette.
Yes, you did, but still, we're there. Questions?
And so folks, just to let you know, we're at the 11:45 mark. If you do have questions, feel free obviously to stick around. If we can give just some Zoom applause here for Dr. Jamerson, and thank you for that too. So we'll leave, and feel free to do the chat. You can also just Zoom hand and unmute yourselves for some questions, folks, and I'll pause our